So today we've got a viewer suggestion, and we're going to take a quick look at the Doom Lucio Moira comp as well as its secret weapon. As we talked about in the last video, all comps in 5v5 rely on range and escape options to deal with the threat of burst damage, and although this comp does have range in the form of movement cooldowns, it doesn't have any poke, and so leans more on the escape side of things. We usually see this comp compared to the old 6-man comp with Monkey D.Va, a comp that can brawl in the front line, overlapping their AoE healing and tanking cooldowns, in order to absorb a huge amount of pressure. Then, they can use escape CDs to disengage to a stabilization position out of enemy LOS, where they can quickly reset cooldowns and heal up, turning any damage taken into support ult charge. The comp was then free to repeat these cycles until they isolated a target through a sombra flank, or built the ults they needed to hard commit. And that continued cycle was the real strength of the 6-man comp, since all the individual heroes were very slippery and difficult to catch, and stabilized so quickly in cover that it was difficult to take advantage of their downtime. Most importantly, on maps with good stabilization positions, this gave the 6-man comp a passive advantage, where even though they would get outpoked on paper, and so you'd think they'd be forced to push in quickly, the rate at which they built their ults, particularly the supports, was so fast that if you didn't interrupt these skirmish cycles somehow, they'd be able to build enough of an ult advantage to overwhelm you. I talk about that a lot in the passive advantage video, so maybe check that out for a more in-depth look. There were a decent amount of counters to this comp, but mostly it was just a skill check. You needed to hit headshots, sleep darts, echo cooldowns. You needed to be able to ruthlessly punish enemy DPS on the flanks, and ruthlessly interrupt their skirmish cycle by making a surgically timed push during their downtime. But in 5v5, however, that default playstyle doesn't work quite as well, since we only have one tank and so can't overlap those tanking cooldowns in order to absorb pressure and stabilize, meaning we get burst much easier by those headshots and sleep darts if we spend too much time brawling in frontline. And this really hurts one of the main strengths of that old comp, the ability to safely take those repeated skirmish cycles until the supports could farm ultimates. With extended brawls happening that involved two frontline tanks, Moira Lucio could farm ultimates incredibly quickly, which put a lot of pressure on the enemy team to commit to a play that made them vulnerable to an engage. But in 5v5, those brawls are much shorter and only involve one tank, who also gives reduced ult charge, meaning it's not only much more difficult to stabilize after a skirmish cycle, but we also need to do a lot more of them to build the support ults. So although the 5-man comp does have a lot of similarities to 6-man, we have to be careful when comparing them, since instead of relying on the passive advantage built during those cycling skirmish engages, we're relying on other aspects of 6-man, like being able to rotate through enemy LOS, forcing the objective, catching enemies on flanks, and most importantly, abusing the strength of trades in Overwatch 2. So the typical 5-man comp looks something like this, with Doom, Reaper, Tracer or Echo plus Moira Lucio. In the mirror, there's a good argument for playing Monkey instead, but we're not really talking about that today. Echo works well with this comp when she can start fights close enough to the enemy backline to go for a trade, but she struggles when the team has to go for rotations through enemy LOS or has to cover a long distance, which is where we tend to swap to Tracer. So we tend to see Echo on defense and Tracer more on the attack, although it depends a lot on map and hero preference. A typical fight for 5-man looks something like this. The core opens with a long rotation to clear one side of the map and get closer either to the enemy backline or to the objective. Since you're all pathing together in the early fight, you can both heal up any range poke, as well as easily clear any flankers you run into on your way. These types of long rotations are how the comp gets around not having suitable heroes for that 5v5 default setup we talked about last time. Ideally, with the engage range of Doomfist, Reaper and Tracer, this rotation will put you in dive range of the enemy backline. The best teams with this comp will force the enemy backline to counter-rotate away from them and into the path of their own flanker, either a Tracer that they've left behind during their early rotation, or a Reaper who has a teleport angle. From that position, it's pretty easy to take a direct engage. Those divers have a huge amount of burst damage between them, especially if you've already skirmished a little to force important cooldowns like nade, or if the whole squad, including the supports, are able to follow through. Because remember that your supports still have to avoid getting traded, and if you gotta dodge the enemy dive, you might as well do it in the direction of your dive target if the situation allows. So providing you can rotate in to begin with and the enemy don't hit all of their cooldowns, you actually have a decent chance of being able to burst the enemy backline. Those divers also have great escape cooldowns, so if you go for that engage but the enemy respond with powerful ultimates, you have a good chance of being able to disengage and stabilize until you're ready to go again. Also, if you do that rotation in and nobody is in range to engage onto, then you should be in a position to start forcing the objective, which will either bring enemies into range or force their DPS to take angles, which you can then dive into and punish. On defense, this overall default is pretty much the same, except you can just set up around the chokes to begin with since you already have space, then look to dive the backline when the enemy push in. This whole playstyle is pretty simple, but still has good potential. The most interesting bit in the new game, however, isn't how the comp wins fights, it's how the comp wins maps. Since although you can set up some good fights with smart rotations, it isn't really that good versus a team that can hit their headshots in cooldowns, and you don't really have the best ult cycles either, so that default playstyle alone isn't enough to make the comp worth playing. Which brings us to the importance of trade kills in 5v5. In Overwatch, whenever a team starts to lose a fight, you tend to see them split up and take risks to turn the fight or get trades, while the winning team groups up more and takes less risks to try and hold their advantage and win the fight with a full team. In 6v6, the off-tank acted as the main guard against enemies taking risks towards the end of a fight. A traitor blinking in with pulse bomb or an Ana running it down with nade, the off-tank was there to stop the trades. But in 5v5, there is no off-tank, so you have way more opportunities to get those types of trades. In standard 5v5 comps like Monkey Ana, we've seen this used to great effect by teams like Seoul, who have great dive synergy and ridiculous post-fight pulse bombs. Every time Smurf trades out on the enemy backline or Prophet hits a pulse to get a trade at the end of a lost fight, means that the enemy aren't able to start the next fight with a full squad. This is super important since it lowers the enemy's ability to push up and take strong positions. Most fights in Overwatch have the team that won the previous fight pushing up to hold space that the enemy then have to push into when coming out of spawn, which puts the first team at a big advantage because of how strong chokes are. However, if that team doesn't start the fight with a full squad, they aren't able to play as aggressively holding the space, and so the team pushing in has a much easier time in what is basically the most difficult part of Overwatch, and where teams often have to commit ultimates or big chunks of their time bank in order to break through the choke. Getting those trade kills also heavily interrupts the enemy's ult cycles, like how killing an Ana at the end of a fight means she isn't able to get that clean up ult charge in order to help her build nano for next fight. In Overwatch 1, you would be pretty happy to get a single trade at the end of a fight, and it would make the next fight easier, but the enemy can hold space with 5 players fairly easily. But in Overwatch 2, not only does one trade kill count for much more in terms of making it easier to push, if you commit hard enough to the trades, you can expect to get 2 or even 3 trades some fights, which gives you a huge advantage in the overall macro fight structure of the map, since you're denying the enemy from starting fights as a full squad. And this is more or less what the Doom comp is in a unique position to abuse. It's a comp that is incredibly fast out of spawn, fast to set up fights since they cover distance so quickly, and also has a great ability to get trade kills versus standard comps, meaning that they can often start fights versus an enemy that isn't fully set up. Their speed on the attack means that they can have loads of fights using their attacking time bank while getting those trades, and on defense their sustain options mean they can lose fights very slowly while doing the same, meaning they can really burn down enemy time banks even if they don't win any clean fights. The independence of all these heroes means they're also not really under too much pressure to wait for 5 before starting an engage. You can get away without a Doomfist or a Reaper or even a Moira if you've got ults, which allows you to start skirmishing during that early window of the fight when the enemy is still waiting for their traded teammates to come back from spawn, since not only can you fight without a teammate or 2, but yours will probably get there faster anyway. Obviously you don't have to hard commit during these pre-fight skirmishes, but they're useful for getting a cooldown advantage to abuse once your teammates actually get there. While we've seen teams play the default of that 5-man comp pretty decently, I don't think we've seen any team really embrace that trading aspect. It doesn't matter so much what a team's fight win percentage is, if their time bank control and trade potential allows them to get the map win, even if it's basically via a technicality. And I really think this aspect of 5v5 is a way to turn a comp that could be seen as a crutch into something with some actual competitive potential. So that's just a quick look at an actually fairly simple comp, just one that doesn't follow the default setup of other comps in Overwatch 2, and one that could have a lot of implications in the metagame if a team is able to perfect it. Thanks for listening. This one was a viewer suggestion, so let me know if you got any more ideas.